Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on racial injustice or overcoming racial injustice and ensuring the success of all young children. We're really excited to have you all here today. My name is Mary Garvey, and I am the Director of Innovation and Inclusion at Institute for Child Success. I will go ahead and have our other panelists introduce themselves.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jill Shalnut. I am a lecturer at Clemson University. This topic is near and dear to my heart as I teach one of our pre-service teacher courses in critical issues and cultural diversity.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Dee Steglin, and I'm with the Institute for Child Success as a senior fellow, and I'm also a professor emeritus from Clemson University. And I've been interested in this topic for quite some time, and really am glad that ICS is presenting, is doing collaborative work with other agencies related to systemic racism.
Good afternoon. My name is Letitia Vaughn, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Tri-County Cradle to Career Collaborative, and also a co-founder of an organization, E3, Elevate Empower, that is focused on eliminating racial disparities in education. So I'm very excited to be here as the other panelists with you today, and also because I have two children who attend public schools in South Carolina. So I am highly connected to outcomes. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. So I will get started with an overview of what our webinar will look like for today. So we've done our welcome and introduction. So right after this, I'll move right into our overview of findings from our Racial Injustice in Black Children survey. Next, we will hear a bit from Dee Steglin about preschool suspension and expulsion, which is, of course, one of the ways that racism and implicit bias shows itself in the classroom, and one of the ways that it impacts young children today, and not necessarily something that people think about when they think about 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds getting kicked out of school, essentially. Next, Jill will take us through some examples of what implicit bias looks like in the classroom and what we can do about that, which is, of course, one manifestation of racism in the classroom. Finally, we'll wrap up with Letitia presenting on behalf of Tri-County Cradle to Career with some observations about this moment in history, an overview of some successes thus far, challenges, and an overview of a path forward, what is happening with TCCC, and I will do something similar for Institute for Child Success. So again, thank you all for being here today. There will be time, we planned for time at the end for questions, but also feel free to ask us questions throughout. We're happy to engage with you throughout the course of the webinar. And I also want to note that there will be some live polls during this webinar as well. And we hope that you all participate and answer. It'll be anonymous. We'll have no idea who's responding in what way to the poll. So please feel free to go on ahead and participate and engage with us in that manner. So as you all know, earlier on in the year, there became overwhelming coverage of different incidents that led to protests across the country in all 50 states, as well as several countries, and ongoing conversation about racial injustice in this country and racism and white supremacy and all of these things that have really been going on for a very long time. These things are not new, but there's, for some reason, or probably for several reasons, it became really a topic that many folks across the country were very interested in and wanted to have action around. And so at Institute for Child Success, we know that it's imperative to know what is going on currently and what life is truly like on the ground for Black children in this moment, given all that was happening. And so we thought, who better to hear from than the people who likely love these children the most, and that would be their parents and guardians. And so what you will see in the coming slides are our findings from two informal surveys that were meant to capture stories from the parents and guardians of Black children. We were able to survey 95 respondents or 95 families in 17 different states. You'll see here that 92% of those surveyed were parents and primary guardians to Black children age 18 or younger. The majority of them were from New York State, and the next largest representation was from South Carolina, with 24% of respondents being from South Carolina. At the bottom of the slide, you'll see what other states were represented in these stories. So the first major question that we posed to parents and guardians of Black children had to do with increased worry, whether or not recent incidents had made parents of Black children feel more worried about their child's future. And the options were to respond with yes, no, or unsure. Here you'll see that 89% of respondents responded with yes, 9% responded with no, and 2% remained unsure. And so to be clear, for these questions, what we ended up doing was sorting it out so that we only, for these particular questions, only were looking at responses from actual parents. And so there were some regional differences that might be worth noting in these particular responses. As I said, the first survey that was given was the more New York-centric survey, where 73% of those respondents were from New York, and in the second survey, 46% of respondents in the second survey were from South Carolina. Very similar surveys, but there were some differences, just a handful of differences with questions. So in the first survey, the more New York-centric survey, for the increased worry question, you'll see that there is a bit of a difference, a slight difference in those who responded that yes, they do have increased worry for their children. 91% in the survey that had more New Yorkers, and 86% in the survey that had more South Carolinians. As for those who responded that they did not have more increased worry due to recent incidents, 7% in the first survey said that they did not have an increased worry, and whereas 12% in the second survey that had more South Carolinian respondents said that they did not have increased worry. And you'll see that as for the response of unsure, it was pretty even there. So next, I'll read off some of the quotes that we have, basically families telling our stories of why they responded the way that we did. So we'll see in this first quote, the current racial tension in our country makes me worry about his future. Black people have been suffering with racism for so long that we teach our children tactics to stay alive. Over the years, a few incidents will raise the issue, but nothing really changes. People do a lot of talking, but the system level change that needs to take place never gets addressed. And that's from a parent or guardian of a 3-year-old boy in South Carolina. Next, we'll see another quote. The media and Black Lives Matter are making my sons feel that people hate them because of their color. They never felt like that before. I have taught them not to hate and that they have not experienced hate. I will not allow the media and Black Lives Matter to bring their division and racism into my children's minds. I fight that every day. And that is from a family in California where there are 12 and 14-year-old boys in the household. The next comment, I feel that she has been treated unfairly as far as discipline at her school. After an altercation with a white student, my child was punished more harshly when it was the other student who instigated the situation. And that comment is from Connecticut, the parent of a 14-year-old child. I'm the mother to an Afro-Latina child. Recently, I was cooking and she had news playing in the background. I did not think my daughter was paying attention. She saw police officers pushing peaceful protesters. She asked me what was going on, and I had to explain to my 4-year-old that sometimes Black people aren't treated nicely. Protesters are trying to get change so that Black people get fair treatment. She should be concerned about dolls and painting, not racism. That upsets me. And that is from a mother in New Jersey, mother to a 4-year-old daughter. The next comment, shortly after Michael Brown was killed, I got pulled over with my daughter in the car. Police asked where I was coming from and what I was doing, then asked me about whether or not I had drugs and guns in the car. I just knew as a Black man that I was going to jail, and my 8-year-old was sitting in the back seat. Afterwards, I drove a mile, then I pulled over and cried. In that moment, I was glad I had a Black daughter and not a Black son. A year later, Sandra Bland died, and I realized that it doesn't matter if I have a Black daughter. We all have a target on our back. That is the most disheartening part, that even my Black daughter and wife aren't safe. And that is from a father in Maryland to a 14-year-old girl. Moving on to the next question. And this one centered on emotion felt based on the perception of skin color or race. When thinking about how society may view your child's race and or skin color, what one word captures your emotion? So here you'll see a word cloud that summarizes the different responses to that particular question. In this case, the word cloud has in larger fonts the words that appeared more often than others. So we'll see that those words are words such as angry, unfair, sad, unjust, inferior, misunderstood, inequality, uneducated. Those are some words that appeared more than once. Several respondents commented with those single words. I'll just leave it up for a few more seconds so you can take a look at some of the others. Marginalized, ignorant, less than. Terrified. In saying that I am terrified, I'm very scared. What can I do as a parent to make my kids feel safe? Being respectable or engaging in respectability politics doesn't help. I want my kids to be their full and true selves, but I know that doing so could endanger them. This is a mother of one-year-old twins, a boy and a girl in Texas. Uncertainty. Their race is polarizing in terms of how they are viewed, depending upon the person. I fear for their safety when they are away from family and major systems, such as school, where they are primarily safe. And this is from the guardian or parents of 9, 15, and 17-year-old girls and a 17-year-old boy in Florida. Horrified. I live in the state where Breonna Taylor was killed in her home with her boyfriend. It has been 4 months, and Louisville Metropolitan Police Department, Mayor Greg Fisher, and Attorney General Daniel Cameron still have not arrested the officers who killed her. That is horrifying. And this is coming from a mother in Kentucky, of course, that's where this incident happened, to 5 and 11-year-old girls and a 7-year-old son and a 6-month-old son. And just a note here, about the timeline of these surveys. These surveys were done in June and July. So that is why you'll see, of course, that the update is not reflected here, and that at the time it was 4 months since this incident has happened. And I just want to note, the reaction to these officers not being charged and kind of the anger in the community. N-word, that was one of the words in the word cloud. Never call us that. Treat us the same way as you treat other people. Help reprogram people from using that word and any other slave master word. We as Black people have feelings and we need equal treatment as anyone else. Stop placing roadblocks for us. And that is a comment from South Carolina. This is a parent or guardian to a 6-year-old boy and 9 and 11-year-old girls. So our third question focused on how we could better serve Black children. So not necessarily just ICS, but just in general, organizations that work on behalf of children or for children in any kind of capacity or in general within the community. Given the current and ongoing climate of racial injustice in our country, what advice would you give, or what would you want an organization committed to improving outcomes for children to know, so that the organization can, with empathy and understanding, effectively serve families, Black families and Black children? Combat adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACEs. I recommend that organizations provide therapy for PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Boys and a 17-year-old girl. Diversity sensitive. It starts with diversity training. I believe diversity training should be for everyone. Diversity training should be built into every school and every organization that serves children or influences policy. And this comment is from a mother of 13 and 18-year-old girls in New York. Focus on policy. I've had to have the talk with my boys at age 7. I never expected that this would be on my list of things to do as a mom so soon in their development. An early childhood research and policy organization has got to get ahead of the conversation. A think tank influences policy. Without your organization's guidance on these things, we will never get policy that will shift the conversation. You are the experts sitting at the table, and this is from a mother to 9-year-old twins in North Carolina. Do the work, minimize implicit bias. I'm the chair of the Black Alumni Board at my alma mater, and I know that I cannot solve racism. I deal with racism, but I cannot solve it. White people, especially white teachers, need to not see Black children as a threat. In 3rd grade, my teacher asked me how I could dress so nicely if I have a single mom. Dressing nicely didn't make her think that I was from a home where I was taken care of. Instead, it made her suspicious of my means. White people need to do the work. And this is, once again, a mother to 1-year-old twins, a boy and a girl in Texas. Get to the root of the issue. I shouldn't have to provide advice. That's the problem. Why does anyone need to tell racist and bigoted people how not to be that way? And this is from New York, a parent to 15-year-old twin boys, a boy and a girl. Silence is consent. Speak up. I would want an organization to know that parents are afraid, that we don't trust the very systems that have been oppressing us for years. Racism will not change until our white peers open their mouths and speak. With racial injustice, silence equals consent. Organizations should also note that children begin to recognize their differentiated treatment as early as age 2 and 3. The silence is also noted by children. For this comment, I really encourage you to really understand the silence is consent sentiment. One of the things that you can maybe read to better understand it, if you'd like to do so, is Letter from Birmingham Jail, which was written, of course, by Martin Luther King Jr., and it touches on this concept a bit. And I believe that Lisa will be providing some links to resources in the chat. Admit it, we all see color. Not seeing color is part of the problem. We all see color, but the respect and dignity need to be the same. And this is coming from a mother to a 13 and 18-year-old girls in New York. And you will know that if you've ever seen, a list of, triggers around race and racism, many times this is one of them. When people say, I don't see color. Use white privilege for good. Use white privilege to educate, inform, and change systems. And this is the comment from a parent of a boy, a 3-year-old boy in South Carolina. Race baiting. I just want the race baiting to stop. I have not been treated differently, and maybe someone of my color has been, but that is not the case for me. I fear that my children will be looked down on because of the hatred that is going on in the world. And this comment comes from a parent or guardian of a 9-year-old boy and 14-year-old girl in South Carolina. So we have here now a poll for you, with the question being, during this climate, should discussions of bias, racism, and injustice be considered race baiting? So we'll give you a few seconds to complete that poll, and then we'll keep going. So 67% of you all said no, it should not be considered race baiting, and 33% of you all said you are unsure as to whether it should be considered race baiting. So question number 4, about our Black children. I believe that there is value in making visible the potential for beauty, hope, and joy in the future of our world, a future that includes the Black children we know and love, as well as the little ones we have not met yet. What would you like community leaders to know about your child? Her life matters. Her past, present, and future matter. Too many times we as adults dim the lights of kids because we need them to conform to what's normal. What if we listen to them more and realize that what's normal for us can dim their light and make them less hopeful for their own futures? And that comes from parent or guardian of 3 and 7-year-old girls in Illinois. God gave him a phenomenal brain. I have watched him grow, and he has an exceptional ability in the engineering and math realm. He is loving and mischievous. He is a great orator. He loves to go on stage at Barnes & Noble and tell jokes in the latest book. He is friendly. He loves chicken nuggets and chocolate milk, He will come and hug you for no visible reason. His love language is that he seeks approval. He learns with little or no effort. It comes natural to him. He has wanted to be a race car driver since he was 2. He still loves Lightning McQueen. To meet him is to love him. Did I mention that he is cute too? Thank you for letting me share about my gift from God. And that comes from a mother to a 10-year-old boy in South Carolina. My children are so much more than the color of their skin. They're artists, athletes, computer coders, great friends, sensitive people. They are amazing people who can be great adults if they are given a fair chance. And that comes from a parent or guardian in New York with a 13-year-old girl and a 12-year-old boy. My 17-year-old daughter is #1 in her class. She was a Duke Tip Scholar for 4 years. She plans to attend North Carolina A&T University in Greensboro to study animal sciences and obtain a degree as a veterinarian surgeon for small animals. She is 5'11" and gorgeous, articulate, and loves her church. She is a class act. And that comes from a mother in South Carolina with 17 and 12-year-old girls. Okay, so we will move on to Dee next, who will talk to us a bit about implicit bias as well as preschool suspension and expulsion, but I do want to just have a moment to see if there are any comments currently about this section or any questions relating to the stories and responses that you just heard. Okay, moving along to Dee.
Thank you very much. I want to share some information with you about preschool suspension and expulsion. And this actually may be a practice that some people are not aware of, and others may be very aware of it. Okay, slide. Can I do it? Some important facts about preschool suspension and expulsion. It really needs to be more aware or visible to the general population. And in 2005, a group from the Yale Study Center was doing an exploratory study in Massachusetts, and they were looking at just general early childhood practices. And what they found was that there was a much larger percentage of young children being expelled or suspended from their early childhood settings than they were ever aware of. So we've fast forwarded now to 2020, so it's been 15 years since we really became aware of this issue. And it's an issue of growing importance because of the expanded number of 4K, 3K, and other kinds of inclusion programs in the public schools. And also because in the research, we're finding that there's a disproportionate number of children who are suspended or expelled who are either Black or Latino, and they tend to be boys. So this is both a race and a gender issue. And the rate of suspension and expulsion for preschool children continues to be higher in many places than for the K-12 population. Early suspension and expulsion is another form of trauma. And in 2017, the National Association for the Education of Young Children, which we know of as NAEYC, published some facts. And in their research, they found that almost 9,000 3- and 4-year-old children are expelled from their state-funded preschool or pre-kindergarten classrooms every year. That does not include childcare settings or privately funded classrooms. These are just public funded. So 10 years after the finding, the original finding in 2015, we found that there was still the tendency for African American and Latino children to be expelled versus white, along with English language learners and students with disabilities. And all of these children would benefit most from staying in the school and being a part of a high quality preschool program. And most of these children were boys. Preschool suspension and race matters because over 3.5 times as many Black children are suspended from preschool than white children. And to give you another perspective, Black children account for roughly 19% or about 1/5 of all preschoolers. But when it comes to the suspension and expulsion data, nearly 50% or half of those preschoolers who get it suspended are Black. Also, preschool suspension tends to be related also to gender. And in this case, it's usually boys. Some data on that suggests that it's disproportionate. Boys represent about 54% of the total preschool enrollment. But when you look at the data on children who are receiving suspensions, it's almost 80%. So you see fewer boys, but larger percentage of suspension. Okay. Another topic that's gotten a lot of interest is implicit bias related to preschool suspension and expulsion. And researchers are studying the role that implicit bias plays in the decision-making related to suspension and expulsion, both on the part of teachers and also administrators. A definition of implicit bias, and it's important because we all have implicit biases. Implicit bias is an unconscious, which means we're not really aware of them, but they're unconscious favoritism toward or unconscious prejudice against people of a particular race, gender, or other demographic that then influences our behaviors and actions or perceptions toward those people. So we have some research going on related to implicit bias and suspension, and we found that teacher implicit bias is believed to be an important factor in this practice. In the Yale Child Study Center produced a publication, a study in 2016, so it's pretty recent, in which they interviewed teachers of all different kinds of backgrounds, and they found that teachers held an implicit bias toward boys, especially who were physically larger and who were Black or Latino. And so that means that these teachers, regardless of whether their own race, what their race was, or age, carried with them this unconscious perception that was influencing how they saw the children that they were teaching. And this bias tended to not favor boys particularly, and particularly boys who were physically larger and who were Black or Latino. I'm a former teacher educator, and I think this has been particularly interesting to me, that the role of teachers and their decision making in the phenomenon of suspension and expulsion. So we're doing more research based on teacher education, and we're trying to communicate to particularly early childhood teachers the concept of implicit bias. The fact is, we all have them. We all have unconscious biases that are formed by experiences that we had in our early upbringing, where we grew up, and by our parents or other significant adults who influence the way we perceive the world. So we all have them, we just need to recognize that. So we're finding that helping teachers begin to do some self-awareness, some reflection, and to gain insight into their own possible teacher biases is helpful. Some other things we're finding that helps deal with this practice is providing more support for early childhood teachers. Early childhood classrooms are very complex places, as most of you know. So we're looking at things like class size. Obviously, teachers who have responsibility for 15 children versus 20 children, for example, are more able to meet the needs of individual children. We're also providing more support for behavioral analysis and intervention. And also looking at teacher well-being. How do teachers react to the constant stress that they're under? And there's something called secondary trauma. And we think that teachers who are dealing with children who have trauma backgrounds over a period of time begin to experience, it's like almost like post-traumatic stress. It's another form of trauma. And then helping teachers realize that there are mental health services, both for teachers and for children, and that many children who are exhibiting behaviors that are challenging really have trauma in their background and are in need of mental health services, and helping teachers to better understand what are the effects of early trauma on young children. We do know it affects brain development, and so how children respond to and react to things in the classroom can be caused by a pattern of early trauma. The practice of preschool suspension and expulsion should help us focus, all of us, even more on the mental health of preschool children. And for many people, they don't realize that 3, 4, and 5-year-olds can have mental health issues. We somehow associate that more with adolescence and definitely with adulthood. But helping them realize that mental health of preschool children and the likelihood that these children are more likely to experience mental health issues. So having a child experience expulsion or suspension adds to the level of trauma that they may have already experienced and contribute or exacerbate mental health issues that they have. We're also interested in both the immediate and the long-term effects and implications for a child who's been expelled or suspended at a very young age. It can be a very traumatic experience for a 4-year-old to be booted out of their classroom. It's also very traumatic for the parents for a variety of reasons. Everything from how they question their own parenting, they question their child. I'm sorry. They question their own child, and then it can affect their work patterns too. If their child is not able to go to their preschool setting, then what do they do? Because they need to go to work. And then we're finding that young children who were expelled at an early age are more likely to develop attitudes of resistance and negativity toward going to school. And they're more likely to be a child who drops out more on a permanent level, like in middle school or high school. So we think there are long-term implications as well as short-term. A very useful tool for anyone who's interested in this topic, and I think Lisa and Mary are providing the link to this particular document. There was a joint statement, policy statement, developed by the Departments of Education and Health and Human Services. And it was a few years ago. It's all very current though. The purpose of this policy statement is to support families, early childhood programs, and states by providing recommendations from those two departments, the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Education. This is at the federal level, to help prevent and severely limit the practice of expulsion and suspension in early childhood settings. It's a very well-written document, and if you are with an agency or a school or you're a parent, you might want to look at this document because it's very constructive in building the case why there are better options for dealing with children who are having experiences in the classroom that are challenging, and the teacher maybe is at a loss as how to deal with it. But really encouraging schools to look at almost any other alternative than suspension or expulsion. Okay. Some state level policy and practice that we're seeing across the country related to preschool suspension and expulsion. A lot of schools are assessing their own practices and policies of suspension and expulsion in general, and in particular for young children. They're also undertaking more broad training about trauma for all of their staff, teachers, school counselors, school psychologists, anyone who works in the school needs to be aware. Even people who work in the food service or nursing, they need to better understand what is early childhood trauma, what are the effects on the child, and how can I as a professional, regardless of the role that I'm taking in the school setting, support this child and understand their behaviors. And also helping all staff understand that there are federal guidelines and laws that protect young students, particularly students who have special needs. It is not legal to remove a child with special needs or to expel or suspend them from a publicly funded classroom. Most administrators are aware of this, some are not, but this is a good place to start, and that's just becoming really informed about what is the policies that are accepted in the United States. Also, mental health and behavioral supports for children. Some school districts are collaborating with community health centers. They're hiring mental health specialists with early childhood backgrounds to come into classrooms and work with teachers to identify and serve the needs of children and provide the kind of mental health support that they and their families often need. And it's very helpful for a mental health specialist to sit down with a teacher who's dealing with 20 children, and maybe 2 or 3 children are really challenging him or her every day. And the teacher feels responsible for all 20 children, not just those 2 or 3. So they have to answer to the other 17 or 18 families or parents whose children are also in that classroom. And when a mental health specialist can work with the teacher to look at the behavior more objectively and begin to try to get to the roots of what's causing the behavior rather than just reacting to the behavior itself. And also, many schools are beginning to realize that teachers are under a lot of duress, and they're beginning to address the need for teachers to receive mental health support and to have adequate time for medical leave or days off, or providing mental health support for teachers who might need it. So more support for teachers in general. And finally, most school districts are recognizing that this is not good practice, and they're trying to move to eliminate suspension altogether. Some policy resources that we'd like to recommend to you include what's listed here on this handout or this slide: Stepping Stones to Caring for Our Children, National Health and Safety Performance Standards; Birth to 5, Watch Me Thrive, which addresses in developmental and behavioral screening practices; and the National Center on Early Childhood Mental Health Consultation, Center for the Social Emotional Foundation for Early Learning, and the Technical Assistance Center on Social Emotional Intervention. That's a lot of different acronyms there. But these bolster staff training on social, emotional, and behavioral support for very young children. And given the context of COVID during 2020, when children do finally go back to school on a regular basis, it is my hope that administrators and teachers will focus on the social, emotional needs of children first, and then begin to address the academic gaps that exist. Because, you know, we've all been traumatized this year. Families have been traumatized, parents who are trying to work at home with their jobs, teach their children who can't go to school. Children are traumatized because their relationships with their peers have been severed. Maybe they had a favorite teacher and they've been cut off from really having direct interaction. So we've all, I think we will all know when this passes, just the effect that it's had on us all. But it's good to realize and to take good care of ourselves. So these are just some of the resources we'd like to recommend. These are some simple recommendations and best practices for all preschool settings. And out of a class of 18 to 20 children, most teachers are going to identify 3, 4, or 5 children who probably need extra support and attention. And these are some strategies to use to help develop consistency, not just for those children, but for all the children. Create and maintain consistent daily routines for classrooms. That doesn't mean it has to be rigid, but it needs to be predictable. And the use of daily calendars, visual props, photographs that actually illustrate what the teacher expects can be very, very helpful for children who are stressed. Tell children when something out of the ordinary will occur so that they know that in 20 minutes, there's going to be a loud sound, which is going to be some kind of a test of the fire drill or something. You know, all of us kind of respond to those things, but for a children who's been traumatized or is extra sensitive, they particularly need to know if something out of the ordinary is going to happen. Offer children, all children, developmentally appropriate choices. Children want to come to their classrooms feeling like they belong. And one way a teacher can do that is by delegating tasks and roles for all the children, so that it creates within children a sense of empowerment by allowing them to make choices about maybe the menu they're going to choose for lunch, or maybe sitting with a certain group, or being the line leader, or being the caboose on the line, or other roles that the teacher has within the room. So give children choices. It helps build their self-esteem and empowers them. And finally, teachers need to anticipate when there might be difficult periods and transitions during the school days, and offer extra support for children during these times. If he or she does that, she'll find that the majority of the students are able to negotiate those transitions pretty well, and she'll have more energy and time to provide extra support for the children during those times. I'll be glad to take questions a little bit later, and would refer you again to the joint statement from the Departments of Education and Health and Human Services. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dee. And as Dee said, we can take those questions a bit later, or right now, whatever your preference may be. I know that that's a lot of information to take in, but some very useful tools and tips at the same time. So I'll just give a few seconds and see if there's anything that should be addressed right now before moving on. All right. Well, next we have Jill, who will be tackling implicit bias in the classroom.
Again, I'm Dr. Jill Shelnut, and I mentioned that one of the courses that I teach at Clemson University is centered around critical issues in early childhood and cultural diversity. And so we allow our pre-service teachers to examine their own implicit biases, and through some of that work, I'd like to share a few of the scenarios with you. So I would like to begin with a brief scenario from a kindergarten classroom, again, because we're focused on early childhood. And so I'll read it aloud to you, and you're welcome to follow along. At the beginning of the year in Ms. Verwaine's class, the children are working on an All About Me project. They begin by drawing pictures of themselves based on observations of their reflections in a mirror. Next, the teacher provides them with sentence starters asking them to describe their hair color and texture, their skin color, and their eye color. In this racially and ethnically diverse class, the children learn a variety of vocabulary words they can use to describe these differences. So as a follow-up to this scenario, some of you who might work with young children might have done this exact same activity, but as a follow-up in this particular example, there was an incident on the playground after school where some of the parents were sort of chatting about the project that the kindergartners were engaged in. And one of the white moms named Ellie told the other parents that the project made her feel uncomfortable, okay? So in thinking about what the children did in the project and the concerns of one of the parents who happened to be white, our next slide asks for you to share your opinion, your agreement to a statement. Do you feel that children should be shielded from learning explicitly about race and racial differences? So yes or no. We'll give you just a few seconds to share your thoughts. Should they be shielded from learning about race and racial differences? Okay, great. So that's pretty interesting that we had 100% consistency on the responses there. So you all believe that children should not be shielded. So in other words, you support an activity like the example in Ms. Verwaine's class. And I think it's really important. I feel like in this sense, we might be preaching to the choir a little bit. But what we know is that adults may worry that introducing these kinds of topics too early could be harmful to children. Some adults might feel that way, such as the parent in the example, Ellie. But schools and families in collaboration really have an obligation to foster young children's positive racial identities, okay? All right, let's look at the next one. So again, another poll question. Do you agree or disagree with this statement from Ellie, again, the white parent of one of the children? Since it's the beginning of the year, the kids should be doing things that help them see what they have in common rather than emphasizing their differences. Do you agree or disagree with that statement? Okay. All right, so we have the majority of folks who shared their opinion that they disagree, that in other words, the kids should not necessarily be doing things that emphasize their common characteristics, but also emphasize their differences. And one person agreed with the statement. So what we know from the research then is that yes, it really is important for teachers to draw attention to the identities of children, such as the activity that Ms. Verwain engaged the children in to look at their facial characteristics, their hair color and texture, and their eye color. So children's awareness of these racial differences and this impact of racism can really begin quite early. In fact, as early as about 3 years old. So therefore, parents and educators do have an obligation to teach children about these critical and complex issues and through simple activities such as the one that Ms. Verwain engaged in. Okay. So again, when schools and families work together to identify and affirm children's racial identities, the research tells us, sort of documents the true benefits in multiple areas of children's development. So we're not just talking about their physical development, we're talking about socially, emotionally, in all areas of development. So this concept of being colorblind, Mary alluded to in some of the feedback from the families who were included in the studies that she talked about earlier. So here's a quick scenario about the same parent, Ellie, who had the issue on the playground. Ellie grew up in the Midwest in a mostly racially homogeneous environment and noted that race was never discussed in her upbringing. Echoing this colorblind view that many white families espouse, Ellie recounted, "I don't think I thought about it much. I always thought everybody's wonderful, everybody's the same." So when her daughter began to attend public school, Ellie and some of the other white parents discussed their concerns about Ms. Verwain's curriculum. So again, this idea of what is referred to as colorblind is shared in Ellie's reaction, but what we know to be true is that actually silence in regards to these racial injustices sort of equates to consent, which is also something that was shared in the sentiments from the families earlier from the survey. And so, yes, everyone is wonderful, but we need to acknowledge one another's, we need to acknowledge these different racial qualities and, you know, let children celebrate who they are. We can't just blanket statement say everybody's the same, right? So that's what we've sort of learned through this scenario. Okay. So Ellie, the parent, again in this situation, discussed the worksheet assignment where the children were looking at their racial features in the mirror, and she finally figured out that not speaking about race to children didn't protect them. So in other words, she realized that the children were simply able to celebrate, recognize each other's features, you know, kind of really get to know one another on a deeper level and appreciate each other's qualities. So now the next thing I'd like to do is discuss some practical strategies and activities that you can engage in at home or at school if you work with young children. So this first slide really sort of asks you to consider a set of questions to help you figure out who you are as a cultural being. And this is a really important activity just to be reflective and recognizing your own strengths, your own privileges, your background, and hopefully or potentially be able to use your privilege to support others. And in addition to that, also acknowledge areas where you need to learn more about yourself and about others. So again, it's a reflective activity, looking at, you know, who are you as a cultural being and what makes up the threads of your fabric, what aspects of your identity afford you privileges. So if that happens to be race or it happens to be a job that you're in or a community position that you hold, you know, use those privileges to be speaking out on behalf of others and to benefit others. And then what are the racial and linguistic backgrounds of those who surround you? So at work, what do the other people look like, and what is their culture, and what does this tell you about who's surrounding you? And at school, do you see and actively question inequities that are happening in education? And again, it's not enough to simply just read these headlines and listen to these stories. They're certainly inundated on our social media sites and on the news, but what can you actually do on the ground about these inequities? So it's interesting to consider, again, putting teachers in classrooms where children do not necessarily look like them, have not been raised in the same ways as them. So what we do with our pre-service teachers is engage them in a lot of these reflective type activities so that they can learn more about their privileges and sort of break down some of these barriers. So a really neat activity that's very simple to do but very effective in the classroom is called a culture circle. And this is where you provide a safe space to have some challenging conversations or build relationships with children and teachers. Perhaps you bring in other family members into the classroom during these circles. And the idea of the geometry matters is really important so that the circle allows everyone to be focused on one another. It sort of breaks down that idea of there's a side or there's a barrier. Sometimes in classrooms when children share, they speak directly out front to the teacher, but the people behind them may not hear or see their faces. So this idea of a circle really emphasizes equality and connectedness, and it really holds people accountable for being face-to-face. So it's a great opportunity to discuss some of these challenging situations that are going on. And if children bring up situations that they've seen on the news or heard about from family members discussing these terrible incidences that we continue to have happening in our country, this is a great place to allow those safe discussions. And, again, it's not that children are too young to have these discussions. It's just how you make it appropriate and really kind of blur those lines between the teacher being the one with all the information and allowing the children to kind of share from their perspectives. And so asking questions about how does this impact you or your family? Why is this hard for you? What can we do to help you to move forward? Or can you share an experience with us about, blank, blank, blank. So having these culture circles really just sort of fosters that communication and equity in the classroom. Another very simple activity in the classroom, there we go, is the incorporation of children's literature. And this allows you to discuss these more challenging topics such as race and identity through children's books. Very easily accessible. Perhaps the public libraries in your areas are opening back up again or offering some virtual services. Authors are reading stories virtually, which is really conducive to this online virtual learning environment. But children's literature using children's literature allows them to see themselves in what we call a mirror. So some books are mirrors for children's lives where they can connect with the characters. They might see the same environment that they live in. I know the first time I read my group of kindergarten students, 20 some years ago, The Snowy Day, the children were like, what's an apartment? The children that lived in this area here weren't familiar with apartment buildings in big cities. And so to them, that was a new concept. So it allows children to see environments that are familiar, situations that might be familiar. And then children's literature also serves as the window. So children might be able to view this other world that might be different for them. It might take them somewhere looking out the window where they've never been. And then literature can also serve as what we call a sliding door, which allows children to kind of walk through into this imagination, lets them into these different worlds that they otherwise may not be able to experience. So it's a great sort of safe way to introduce some of these concepts, but yet allow children to connect with what they're reading. And on the next slide, I just have a couple examples for you of some of the topics that can be considered. When you look at children's literature, you can choose books specifically to cover topics that, again, may not be the easiest to discuss with young children, but necessary, right? Children need to be exposed to people who are different from them and talk about how, they can help people who might be different from them, or people that are different from them help in their lives. And so you can talk about issues related to everyday themes like poverty and people with disabilities and acceptance, diversity in all different ways and traditions. And so we're not just glossing over some of these really painful truths in our society, but we're using children's literature to kind of support their understanding of these issues. And then a strategy that really helps educators in particular, or those who work in any capacity with young children, in preventing discriminatory behavior for the purpose of really fostering equality or equity in education, is to look at the lens through which they teach or work with these children. So in education, we know from the research that the majority of educators are white, which is over 80%, and female, about 75%. So therefore, we could say that most teachers view education through the lens of white females. But because the performance of children who might look a little bit different from that does not always align with these parameters, it can often be regarded as deficient. And so what we don't want to do is lead to the practices of suspension, expulsion, like Dee mentioned, as early as preschool. So what does this mean then for our children of color? Okay, so we can look at the next slide and kind of talk about, again, doing some really reflective work, each of us who work with children, looking at your lens, how can you identify, looking through your own lens, how is this going to help you promote racial justice in your own classroom settings or your own, through your own work with young children. So the next slide talks about another scenario of a child who is now 16. She's a 16-year-old female, but when she was in kindergarten, she shared a story about being a biracial 5-year-old who was called the N-word in school by a little boy in her class. And at the time, she recounted that she didn't know if she had done anything wrong. She wasn't sure if this was a word that kids could even use. She really wasn't sure what was happening. And then before she knew it, other students engaged in some name calling. Students threw rocks at her at the bus stop. She had trouble after school as well. She started having frequent tantrums and crying spells. Her father tried to explain to her some of the history on the racial injustice. And this happened in the state of Texas, where she grew up in a town with 94% of the population being white. And so she sort of reflected back on this discrimination that she faced in kindergarten. So as we look at the next slide, we see some of the behaviors that she's displaying, right? Because she's fearful and she's confused and she's frustrated. She doesn't have consistency. In the classroom, the teacher might be saying, oh, we're all wonderful, but yet she's not being treated wonderfully. So there's really this lack of trust. And no one really other than her dad is helping her at 5 years old to find a solution. So how will this trauma that Maya has been experiencing and the behaviors that she's displaying impact her as a learner in school? And what she was very honest in saying as she continues through school at 16 is that it's been tough for her as a member of society growing into a young adult. She's really had a difficult time being able to learn school material. She has a hard time getting close and connecting with people and forming relationships. She has difficulty following expectations from teachers because she sees a lot of adults as negatives in her life. And they might not even, year to year be aware of why, but that's her perspective. And so all of these behaviors could easily result in Maya being suspended or expelled as early as, could have been preschool or kindergarten in her case, in her school career, okay? So a lot of times the young children's reactions to trauma, a lot of these physical and emotional reactions, trauma, being excluded based on your race or, being name called, having things thrown at you, all these kinds of things are traumatic situations that young children might then show reactions that look like behavioral issues. Teachers and other administrators or school employees might react to what they're seeing behaviorally, but not examine why the child is acting this way. And so what we know then that some of the external behaviors on the next slide that you can see are very confusing because they often are fueled by these really internal processes that children themselves don't really understand. So if we think about Maya at 5 years old, she didn't know why this child was calling her name. She was just a little girl in the same classroom. So children don't likely understand exactly what's going on, and teachers can't necessarily observe or understand either. So often these signs of early childhood trauma can be mistaken for other developmental issues. It could appear that she's not paying attention. They might think that perhaps she has attention deficit disorder. If she all of a sudden stopped talking as a result of a traumatic event, it might be seen as, even a regression of skills similar to children on the autism spectrum. So what we know then is a lot of these changes in behavior are not easily understood by the child, nor are they easily observed and assessed by the adults in their environment. So a final suggestion that I'll leave you with for the classroom is to really look carefully at your children. And what I mean by look carefully is literally post pictures of them. In the virtual setting, provides us a great opportunity to do this, sort of like we all have the grid of participants in a Zoom session. Put all of your children's faces on the screen if you're able to, or if you're able to print out their photos from school, do that. But you want to kind of just color code with the level of kind of connectedness that you have with each children. So if you've really connected with certain children in the class, you know who they are, you know siblings, you know things that are interesting to them, or likes and dislikes, you could go ahead and put a green sticky note or a green sticker on them. And then for the children who you really don't know very well, you could identify with a yellow. And then you'd place a red on the photos of children with whom you have really not connected with. And I know you're probably thinking as an educator, well, of course I've connected with my children. I really think that if you were to engage in this activity, you'd be surprised at the children who you identify as not having connected with are the ones that you really need to connect with. And I actually saw this activity used at the Ron Clark Academy in Atlanta, and it was just really an effective classroom tool that the teacher said that they just year to year find themselves doing, because it really, again, we have such good intentions. We think we're connecting, we think we're in tune with what children need, but sometimes, what we think we're doing doesn't always match with exactly what is happening, and especially from the child's perspective. So it's a really effective yet simple way to get to know your children a little bit more closely. And I think I saw a message in the chat. I'm not sure if that was for me.
Yeah, it says, does this discussion inform the idea of interracial adoption?
Oh, okay. Do any of you want to tackle that one? Any of my co-panelists? I think it's important to consider the needs of a child. So let me look again at the question, interracial adoption. Yes, so I think that's a similar scenario to Maya, who was a biracial child in the example. And I really think that this is where we really need to be intentional with recognizing the qualities of each child in the classroom and looking at their families. And so that way, if a child's mother or father comes in and their race is different from the child, the children aren't surprised, right? So if in the classroom, another practice would be, having pictures of children's families posted all over, inviting family members in to share that, families can look very different. Okay, and that would be good, Dr. Steglin, too. We can get into that later. Another thing that pops in my head quickly is reading children's literature, such as I shared. The Family Book by Todd Parr covers a lot of wonderful topics about family qualities. And I will let Mary continue from here. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Jillian. Thanks especially for tackling that difficult question, not an easy question. All right, so we will move along. We want to make sure that we adhere to the given amount of time. So next we will have Letitia from Tri-County Cradle to Career, and we'll get some real hands-on advice about what we can do during this time.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks for the opportunity to share with you guys this afternoon. Just in case you haven't been introduced to Tri-County Cradle to Career Collaborative, we are a collective impact organization that focuses on the Tri-County region in the Low Country. So we cover Charleston, Berkeley, and Dorchester, and we work in partnership with 4 school districts. Dorchester 2 and 4, Berkeley, Charleston are the school districts that we overlap with. And I was really excited to be invited to participate in this panel and to listen to Dr. D and Dr. Jill give some really tactical, practical things that need to happen within classrooms, as well as the policy level. Tri-County is actually focused on systems level indicators. So we actually work in partnership alongside community-based organization, families, and students. And our focus is on policies, practices, resource flows, the relationships and the mental models that actually make up the education system. And so as we move forward in this work, and Tri-County has been engaged and involved in racial equity work for a while now. If you are familiar with our annual report, we put out a report to the community, which informs them about data, and we disaggregate data by race specifically. For the last few years have been highlighting the disparities or the achievement gap that occurs between Black, white, and Hispanic students. In our last year's report, one of the things that we talked specifically about was ensuring that we had common language for our community around the issue of race, because we have to all be speaking the same language before we can even move to any type of solution. But in our community, one of the things that's really exciting is that our local YWCA has been putting on Racial Equity Institute workshops, which comes out of North Carolina for the past few years. So there's been a collective effort of the community to participate in learning more about systemic racism and how that plays out across every system in our community. And so for us as a community, there are three kind of truths that we have all embraced as we begin this issue around racial inequities, is specifically with Black children. So one is that racial inequities look the same across systems. So if you look at criminal justice, if you look at healthcare, if you look at education, if you look at the wealth gap, we're all producing the same inequities, and that is because systemic racism is embedded into every system and structure. That is what our country was built upon, and so we have to acknowledge and embrace that. The second, and I am an education major, so I went to school for education and worked in the education system for years and years and years. And this is actually the opposite of what was drilled into me as an education major, but it is true. Socioeconomic difference does not explain the difference in racial inequity. So many times we try to say that socioeconomics explains it, but it does not. If you disaggregate achievement data specifically by race and poor and not poor, you will see gaps between Black and white students still. And so the socioeconomics do not explain the racial inequities. And then the third, which I inferred to at the beginning, was that inequities are caused across systems. And so for us as an organization, we have been intentional these last couple of years about cross-sector collaborations, because we know that problems or inequities in education cannot just be solved in education. And the inequities occur regardless of people's culture or behavior. So as I said before, these policies and practices are embedded into every system and are actually producing the results that they were intended to produce. And so we have to work across systems. An example of that for us in education, especially because we work in the community of North Charleston, is North Charleston actually has the highest eviction rate in the country. So if you think about what that means for children and staying in the same school, it is impossible for a community that has the highest eviction rate to have consistent education, quality education for its children. And so that is an example of a cross-sector partnership that we have to bridge, because we can't solve the education problem without actually tackling the housing problem. You can move forward. So one of the things that Mary asked me to do was really talk about observations and challenges, as well as what we are doing as an organization. And so this section is really just some brief observations from the perspective of our organization, as well as myself, because I've been doing racial equity work for quite a while through education and nonprofit work. And so one of the things that's really exciting to me is that there's a collective awakening that's happening about the existence of systemic racism. I will say before the deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, if I said there was systemic racism, I still had a little bit of pushback, right? And so what's exciting to me is that folks are actually beginning to acknowledge that systemic racism exists, that it impacts all of our systems, our actions. There's a lot of conversation about bias. And so just really excited that these conversations are happening and that we're beginning to see more of a cross section of folks who are involved in the movement to make change. Another thing that's really exciting to me is that major corporations, nonprofit organizations, school districts across the country have made public statements about their alignment to shifting the racial disparities by aligning with organizations like the Black Lives Matter and that movement, including probably one of the best statements I've seen was from Ben & Jerry's, the ice cream company. And they've been actually doing this work for a long, long time. So if you haven't checked out their website around systemic racism, you should check it out. The third thing I would just say is that lots of people are well-intended. So I heard Dr. D and Dr. Jill kind of mention this, that there are a lot of well-intentioned people out there doing work. However, the outcomes have not changed. So the disparity still exists. So that's why it's even more important for us to get down to the actual root of the issue and work on those things. And lots of people, though, want to know what to do. So over the last few months, I've had so many people reach out and to participate and just advise and have conversations and serve on panels like this. So that's really exciting that folks are wanting to figure this out and move to action. But one of the other pieces that I think is a little disheartening and will lead to the challenges is really, our country is really the most divided that I've ever seen it. And so that also is a challenge for us because there's just seems to be some difficulties with us bridging a divide. You can move forward, Mary.
Excuse me, Letitia. There's
Yes.
a question that came in. I don't remember if you covered this or not. What are suggestions for engaging representation in the collection of race-based data from community organizations so that this is a genuine, meaningful process?
There's a couple of suggestions I can make, but I'm wondering if I need to make them towards the end. Mary, you tell me kind of how you want me to move forward.
Yeah, sure. I think that you can answer it towards the end of your presentation if it's a better fit for your flow.
Okay, perfect. So please don't let me forget to come back to that. And so, and I also hesitated because I'm going to talk a little bit about this a little bit more. So I think part of that could be answered. And so with those challenges of the kind of the what's happening within the community, and I shared some successes around, or some things that I've observed around organizations making public statements. But one of the concerns or challenges that we still continue to face is really, and I'll start with the second first. So folks want to move to action, but they don't have a really deep understanding of how to solve the problem, which leads to actions that are perfunctory. So lots of folks have made statements or performative. Lots of folks have made statements, but they haven't moved past that. In our community, lots of people have participated in a 2-day racial equity workshop. And many times we'll hear people say, well, I've done REI, I've done racial equity, like, okay, the box is checked, I'm done, I'm woke. And that's just not the case. This is years and years and years of learning that has to happen. And so, and many times when we move to action before we tackle the problem, we're actually solving the wrong problem. And so there's this idea around like the public statements, and that is a great first step. But if the public statements happen and then there is no visual representation of a shift in policies or diversity within the organization, we see this, for example, with public statements that have been made, but then if I go Google and look on the organization's website, their board of directors still looks the same, who's leading the organization still looks the same, their staffing still looks the same. In our, Dr. Jill talked about the teaching force and what that actually looks like, majority white, majority women. And so if we don't actively work against things, then we are actually going along with the way they are. And so what's really challenging sometimes is getting to the root of what the issue is and helping folks move towards this idea that we have to do more than just write the statement or attend a workshop. So our organization has dived deep in this work. I've shared with you, we've been doing it for a little while, and we still have a lot of work to do. I'm not saying that I don't think anyone has all the answers. But one of the things that we've done, and I know Mary will say that ICS has done, which is really exciting, it is said that we are an anti-racist organization. And that is a signal. That is a signal to the community. That is a signal to those that we interact with. And it's really important for us to understand that as an anti-racist organization, what we're saying is that we're actively working against the status quo. And if you define what anti-racist is and what racist is, what it actually means is, and this was probably the best parallel that I've heard when talking about racism. Racism is like a moving staircase, like the ones you see in the airport. And if you're not walking against it, you're actually supporting it. And we have to come to terms with that many times we're supporting policies and we're supporting practices that actually increase disparities instead of helping students of color, and that we have to actively work against those things. So that's what anti-racism means for us. We also are partnered with a national collection of collective impact organizations, and we've done a lot of work around anti-racism. And in fact, I'm a member of an anti-racism a cohort in which we have co-developed a race equity statement with the collective impacts across the country that has helped us think more deeply about the internal work that we have to do. In addition to that, one of the things that we feel is really important, and really the third and fourth things go together, is this idea of how we work within the community to utilize or to co-develop solutions with them around the issues of education. And so one of the things as a collective that we've done is our thought is that with the pandemic and with the social unrest that's happened within this country, that we have to think beyond returning to education. We want to return better. Because we know that returning to the way it was never served all of our children the way it was supposed to. So we have a steering committee that's comprised of cross-section of the community with over 35 members. And the goal is, how are we going to return better? But we know that as an organization, a nonprofit organization, we cannot internally come up with the solutions, which is extremely important when we're thinking about sustainable solutions for improving education or healthcare or housing. They have to be co-developed with the community. And so we have been working also in partnership with communities across the country to develop a framework for a new education model and to really discuss how we measure success towards equity in this new model. Because again, our goal is not to return to normal, it is to return to better. You can keep going, Mary, and I can move fast and wrap up. I would say the last two things that I would just say for us as successes is the idea that we have to elevate the voices of our children and families. So when Mary asked me to speak on this panel and I heard about the survey that was done to collect information from children and families around their experiences, that is extremely powerful. So within our new education model, what we know is that the voices of the intended beneficiaries of our work and those of us who are close to the pain, who are doing the work, have to be elevated. And up until this point, the challenge for us has been that we have not seen this happen in a meaningful way. And so our children and families have to guide the agenda because they are the ones who are in the middle of the experience. And so that, which leads to the power shifts that need to happen. So if we're going to build a sustainable model and we're going to shift what happens for children and families, we have to be in partnership. So we are in close partnership with organizations like First Step, who serve children and families directly. We are working with them to create a child care provider network that is focused specifically on advocacy, because we know with COVID-19 and the racial unrest, child care providers in particular have been impacted, as well as educators, in ways that many of us just don't even know. And so we believe that the power shifts also need to happen, as well as elevating the voices of children and families, and we're working towards that. The last thing I'll say, Mary, you can go to the last slide, is for us in our path forward, we feel like there are some key takeaways that we've learned over the years that we want to share with you. One is that we just have to listen. So if you are an organization that works with community and you're attempting to engage community, one of the most important first steps is really around listening and learning. Because I said this, I say this all the time. If I'm at Mary's house, I can't come into Mary's house and tell her what she needs to do and tell her what the best solution for her problem is. Mary knows what her problem is, and Mary probably has a viable solution. And many times that's what happens when in our community, but our community is just not connected to access and resources the way sometimes we are as organizations. Learning about systemic racism is extremely important. So workshops like Racial Equity Institute, I would recommend. So the YWC is actually doing those virtually now, which is extremely exciting because they can expand their reach. And it's a 2-day workshop that really highlights the systemic racism that's prevalent in every system. And for me, the first time I went through it was very eye-opening, because we know in education, as well-intended as our teachers are miseducated about history. And so this actually lays out policies and procedures that were put in place specifically to disenfranchise people of color, which is kind of embedded into our history. So it's important that we know that. Connecting with folks who've been doing this work is extremely important. So there are many people who've been doing this work for many years, and so we don't have to reinvent a wheel. As an educator, I don't believe in reinventing something that's already been invented. So I'm always happy to connect with folks to learn from them. Evaluating our current status through things like an equity audit. So if I was gonna be the czar of the world and I were gonna give advice to folks, learning would be 1, making your public statement and creating that would be 2, but the third would be in evaluating your own internal practices. You will not be able to connect with community if your community doesn't feel you're authentic. And so evaluating and auditing helps you to learn more about the steps that you need to take as an individual organization to move towards anti-racism. And then the last thing, which I don't need to expound on, which I talked to you about before, is just empowering, shifting, and co-developing solutions with community. So if the idea comes from your boardroom and your staff, and nobody on your staff looks like, sounds like, or feels like the community, it probably isn't the best idea. And that you have to engage and involve folks who are closest to the pain in the solutions to whatever the problem is. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Letitia. That was a whole lot. And Lisa, could you read off the question before? I just want to make sure that
Yes.
answered, or if not, there might be more that Letitia wants to add.
Yeah.
Okay. What are suggestions for engaging representation in the collection of race-based data from community organizations so that this is a genuine, meaningful process?
Absolutely. So, and I'll share in the chat a box, Tri-County Cradle to Careers community-wide data report, just as an example. But I would not, so race-based data, I'm not sure exactly what important is that the data is shared with the community and the data is disaggregated. And so when you disaggregate data, what it does data doesn't lie. It tells the truth about the standing of if you're speaking about children, if you're speaking about the teaching force, whatever you're speaking about, it shines a light on where your community or where your organization actually is. And so I would say, because I also served as a school principal and I worked in a central office where I supervised schools, and data was a huge part of the work that we did. But data, lots of people are afraid of data, and lots of people, when they see the data, many times people get defensive about their data. And so the position in which we present data is really important. And so for us as an organization, and when I was the leader of a school, what was important to me was not that this data was to blame, but the data was for us to learn. And the data then helped us guide the decisions that we made. And so how we position, and I said that to you to say, how we position and present data is extremely important in the frame in which we discuss data. One of the things that Dr. Jill said that I think was really, really, really important also is this idea that the data does not present folks coming from a deficit mentality. Like, it can't say that these children then are less than, right? Because what we know is that the systems that have been put in place in our communities have not adequately served children and families. So for us, when we think about how we present data and how we frame the data, it's really important that this data is presented in a way that helps us illuminate what's going on, but then also guides us in the direction that we need to go and where we need to work and improve. And that the data is numerical data is one piece of the puzzle. I love the fact that the ICS report also brings in narratives and has conversations with children and families about the impact. And so the other thing I would just say is there are lots of different types of data that we should collect to get an accurate picture of what's going on in an organization, in a school, in a community. So I hope that answers the question just a little bit.
So I will be very quick. I know it's 3:32, so if you're still on, thank you for still being here, even though we're 2 minutes over at this moment. If you need to go, we understand, and the recording will be available to you, and we'll make sure to get it to you. So in this final section, we'll just kind of connect the dots with why ICS cares about this work and what we're doing and what we can, offer to you. And so it is my opinion that if you're a decent human being, you care about this work. but we do have a business case as well. And really it's directly tied to our mission. And we have a mission that is about the success of all young children. And so when we think about all young children, we want to make sure that that includes Black children, that includes Latinx children, that includes Indigenous children, that it includes all backgrounds. And so when we see that there are disparities in how children are being treated and disparities in outcomes and, racial disparities, especially in the midst of racial injustice, it is our mission to see what we can do about that, to see what is within our, what we can do, what's within our scope of work. So here are some of the things that we are doing internally. A lot of, this sounds very common, very similar to what Letitia has gone through just now, told us about in terms of what Tri-County Cradle to Career was doing. Identifying as anti-racist and really committing to that, not just having it be hot air that comes out of our collective mouths. Listening with humility, understanding we don't have all of the answers, and we are experts at ICS in certain areas. We also know that there's a such thing as lived expertise, and we're committed to learning from that. We had something called a 21-day equity kickstart, which I think you all may know it as a 21-day equity challenge. We called it a kickstart because we said, it's going to keep on going. It's just kind of the kickstart of what we do, what we're doing. We have been doing much of this work for several years now, but we know that there needs to be a renewed urgency around it. And so we did go through those sessions for the 21 days. And next week, we will be holding understanding implicit and unconscious bias sessions for our entire staff and board. So this is something that we know that we need to just keep on going with. And there's no point in time where all of a sudden we're fully competent. We just keep learning. And so you'll see the kind of the mix of things that will help to strengthen us internally, DEI training, our anti-racist commitment, and also just focusing on these issues in the research and seeing what, we like to refer to ourselves as having informed policy, or so we want to make sure that the work that we're doing, the research that we're doing, applied policy, that's the term that I was looking for, sorry, applied policy. We want to make sure that the work that we're doing, the research that we're doing can then be translated into actual, whether it's programs or legislation or whatever it is, that we can influence policy, that it is something that doesn't just stay, on our computer, on our laptops, in our papers, but that is something that we can actually see come to fruition, that there's an impact from our research. And just a word on, DEI is a term that gets thrown around a lot, especially now. Everyone wants to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I saw something recently that said, diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance. And I think that was a wonderful way of looking at things. And then I believe that was Verna Myers who stated that. And I saw someone else expand upon it a bit, someone named Daniel Jude. And what he said was, in addition to being asked to dance, it's also choosing the music and being a member of the party planning committee. So just understanding it's not enough to talk about numbers, who's actually sitting at the table and who's speaking, and then who's being heard at this table. So it's not just letting folks inside the door, but what that experience looks like after that moment. So externally, in our mission-based work, the thing that I will pull off of this slide, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, is that we will be reaching out to representatives and policymakers to share the stories that you heard earlier from the racial injustice survey. We do think that representatives should hear from their constituents and folks who live in their regions about what it is that Black children and their families are going through in this moment. And so they keep these stories in mind as they go ahead with policy making. Yes, so I will keep moving along here. So for the things that fall outside of the scope of work that we do here at ICS, we're committed to making sure that we amplify the work of those organizations and individuals that are doing the work that we don't do here at ICS, but that still needs to be done within the community, especially when we think about things like racial injustice. For example, one of those things is mentoring. There's so much research on just the value of mentoring, the value of representation, things like that. We will certainly lift up those organizations that are doing that work and doing it effectively. So finally, and Lisa will provide a link to the full statements in the chats. So anti-racism and our children's future is the name of the statement that ICS put out a few weeks ago. And just a quote from it, you'll see here: Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Elijah McCain, the Emmanuel 9, and countless other individuals were once children aged 0 to 8. So were those that took their lives. We did not have to find ourselves here. We must do better for young children, our children. Their future is one for which we are all responsible. And so that is really, if there's a takeaway here today, I think that would be it. While we are an early childhood focused organization at Institute for Child Success, every adult that you've seen was once a child, right? And there are so many things that happen within early childhood from that period of being born through age 8 that really do impact the rest of life, and outcomes for those particular children, and also outcomes for the children that each individual interacts with. So with that said, I think that we will wrap up with the slides, but we're still here in case you have any further questions or want to discuss a bit. We can certainly hang on, but we also understand that we are over time. Of course, thank you again for joining us, and we will make sure that you get these slides and the various resources in your inbox.
I would like to say that I really appreciate everyone's contributions to this conversation. And I'm feeling, I guess, probably because of the isolation from COVID-19, that I think in some ways we've had more time to reflect as individuals and sometimes as an organization, but we've had less opportunity to put it into action. And I was pleased in the news here in Columbia just the other day. One of the school districts here has made a commitment of hiring 100 minority teachers by, I think it's like 3 years from now. And they've created relationships with teacher ed programs. They're communicating with minority students who are in teacher prep programs. And so to me, that's the kind of evidence we need. We need to see systems saying, yes, we're going to be inclusive. We're going to show it with the people that are in our classrooms. But I do think that COVID-19 has pulled us so many different directions. And I hope that we can continue these conversations so that when we come out of this, we can really put things even more into action.
Thank you, Dee. That's great perspective. So I think we'll hang on here for maybe another 30 seconds and see if there are any other questions. Thank you as well to our panelists. You all really added lots of value to this webinar today, and I appreciate it.